Chapter 1 of Freckles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Freckles by Jean Stratton Porter. Chapter 1. Wherein great risks are taken and the Limberlost guard is hired. Characters: Freckles, a plucky waif who guards the Limberlost timber leases and dreams of angels. The Swamp Angel, in whom Freckles' sweetest dream materializes. McLean, a member of a Grand Rapids lumber company who befriends Freckles. Mrs. Duncan, who gives mother love and a home to Freckles. Duncan, head teamster of McLean's timber gang. The Bird Woman, who is collecting camera studies of birds for a book. Lord and Lady O'More, who come from Ireland in quest of a lost relative. The Man of Affairs, brusque of manner but big of heart. Wessner, a Dutch timber thief who wants rascality made easy. Black Jack, a villain to whom thought of repentance comes too late. Sears, camp cook. Freckles came down the corduroy that crosses the lower end of the Limberlost. At a glance, he might have been mistaken for a tramp, but he was truly seeking work. He was intensely eager to belong somewhere and to be attached to almost any enterprise that would furnish him food and clothing. Long before he came in sight of the camp of the Grand Rapids Lumber Company, he could hear the cheery voices of the men, the neighing of the horses, and could scent the tempting odors of cooking food. A feeling of homeless friendlessness swept over him in a sickening wave. Without stopping to think, he turned into the newly made road and followed it to the camp, where the gang was making ready for supper and bed. The scene was intensely attractive. The thickness of the swamp made a dark, massive background below, while above towered gigantic trees. The men were calling jovially back and forth as they unharnessed tired horses that fell into attitudes of rest and crunched, in deep content, the grain given them. Duncan, the brawny Scotch head teamster, lovingly wiped the flanks of his big bays with handfuls of pawpaw leaves as he softly whistled, "Oh, wha will be my dearie, oh," and a cricket beneath the leaves at his feet accompanied him. The green wood fire hissed and crackled merrily. Wreathing tongues of the flame wrapped around the big black kettles, and when the cook lifted the lids to plunge in his testing fork, gusts of savory odors escaped. Freckles approached him. "I want to speak with the Boss," he said. The cook glanced at him and answered carelessly, "He can't use you." The color flooded Freckles' face, but he said simply, "If you will be having the goodness to point him out, we will give him a chance to do his own talking." With a shrug of astonishment, the cook led the way to a rough board table where a broad, square-shouldered man was bending over some account books. "Mr. McLean, here's another man wanting to be taken on the gang, I suppose," he said. "All right," came the cheery answer. "I never needed a good man more than I do just now." The manager turned a page and carefully began a new line. "No use of your bothering with this fellow," volunteered the cook. "He hasn't but one hand." The flush on Freckles' face burned deeper. His lips thinned to a mere line. He lifted his shoulders, took a step forward, and thrust out his right arm, from which the sleeve dangled empty at the wrist. "That will do, Sears," came the voice of the Boss sharply. "I will interview my man when I finish this report." He turned to his work, while the cook hurried to the fires. Freckles stood one instant, as he had braced himself to meet the eyes of the manager. Then his arm dropped and a wave of whiteness swept him. The Boss had not even turned his head. He had used the possessive. When he said, "My man," the hungry heart of Freckles went reaching toward him. The boy drew a quivering breath. Then he whipped off his old hat and beat the dust from it carefully. With his left hand he caught the right sleeve, wiped his sweaty face, and tried to straighten his hair with his fingers. He broke a spray of ironwort beside him and used the purple bloom to beat the dust from his shoulders and limbs. The Boss, busy over his report, was nevertheless vaguely alive to the toilette being made behind him, and scored one for the man. McLean was a Scotchman. It was his habit to work slowly and methodically. The men of his camps never had known him to be in a hurry or to lose his temper. Discipline was inflexible. But the Boss was always kind. His habits were simple. He shared camp life with his gangs. The only visible signs of wealth consisted of a big, shimmering diamond stone of ice and fire that glittered and burned on one of his fingers, and the dainty, beautiful thoroughbred mare he rode between camps and across the country on business. No man of McLean's gangs could honestly say that he had ever been overdriven or underpaid. The Boss had never extracted any deference from his men. Yet so intense was his personality that no man of them ever had attempted a familiarity. They all knew him to be a thorough gentleman, and that in the great timber city several millions stood to his credit. He was the only son of that McLean who had sent out the finest ships ever built in Scotland. That his son should carry on this business after the father's death had been his ambition. He had sent the boy through the universities of Oxford and Edinburgh, and allowed him several years' travel before he should attempt his first commission for the firm. Then he was ordered to southern Canada and Michigan to purchase a consignment of tall, straight timber for masts, and south to Indiana for oak beams. The young man entered these mighty forests, parts of which lay untouched since the dawn of the morning of time. The clear, cool, pungent atmosphere was intoxicating. The intense silence, like that of a great empty cathedral, fascinated him. He gradually learned that to the shy wood creatures that darted across his path or peeped inquiringly from leafy ambush, he was brother. He found himself approaching with a feeling of reverence those majestic trees that had stood through ages of sun, wind, and snow. Soon it became difficult to fell them. When he had filled his order and returned home, he was amazed to learn that in the swamps and forests he had lost his heart, and it was calling, forever calling him. When he inherited his father's property, he promptly disposed of it, and, with his mother, founded a home in a splendid residence in the outskirts of Grand Rapids. With 3 partners, he organized a lumber company. His work was to purchase, fell, and ship the timber to mills. Marshall managed the milling process and passed the lumber to the factory. From the lumber, Barthol made beautiful and useful furniture, which Updegrove scattered all over the world from a big wholesale house. Of the thousands who saw their faces reflected on the polished surfaces of that furniture and found comfort in its use, few there were to whom it suggested mighty forests and trackless swamps, and the man, big of soul and body, who cut his way through them, and with the eye of experience doomed the proud trees that were now entering the homes of civilization for service. When McLean turned from his finished report, he faced a young man, yet under 20, tall, spare, heavily framed, closely freckled, and red-haired, with a homely Irish face, but in the steady gray eyes, straightly meeting his searching ones of blue, there was unswerving candor and the appearance of longing not to be ignored.